Today we're going to weld the diff on our 2011 Ford Mustang GT drift car. We're going to explain how to do it, we're going to talk about the pros, the cons, and if you should do this to your personal Mustang. So after I did the angle kit, I did a little bit of testing on the street, and the rear was just opening up, so only one wheel was spinning. I really couldn't swing the car around very well, so I never really got to test the angle kit. The Mustang has a clutch type rear locker, and eventually the clutches just wear out. When they wear out, only one wheel spins, or it'll start locking inconsistently, and that's what is happening right now with my car. If the clutches start slipping, one wheel is going to slow down a little bit while the other wheel keeps gaining speed, and depending on which one has grip, the rear is basically going to steer itself into a curb or a crowd or a wall, and it's going to embarrass you at your local Cars and Coffee, which you shouldn't do that at Cars and Coffee anyway. But I really feel like that's why a lot of Mustangs do Mustang things. Sometimes it's because the drivers just aren't experienced, but I had this happen before in my Fox body, and it wasn't fun. So I'm welding mine because I'm not daily in this car. I'm not worried about the tire wear. I'm not worried about anything really breaking. I'm still learning how to drift, and I want this car to be as consistent as possible while in a slide. I don't want any kind of variables that are going to throw me off, and for my own peace of mind, I want to know that it's me that sucks and not the car. Also, S197 rears are relatively cheap and easy to find. If I don't like this welded feeling, I can go ahead and buy another rear, and it's not that big of a deal. It'll take me a day to replace it and cost me a couple $100. Like I said, relatively cheap. It's a lot cheaper than buying a Skyline diff, trust me. I haven't seen many people weld rears on 600 horsepower cars. This car is supercharged and it does make a lot of power. We're gonna see how that goes. My friend Jerry's got a bolt-on 5.0 and his has been welded for a while and he seems to like it. And if something does break, the rear's got 90-some thousand miles on it. It doesn't really owe me anything. If it breaks, it breaks. So some of the downsides of doing this is gonna be that your inner wheel is gonna chirp while driving around parking lots or driving at slower speed. You might want to be a little more cautious in the rain and stuff. With most diffs, you want that inner wheel to spin a little bit slower than the outer because the outer has to move a further distance, so it has to travel faster. If you're in the rain or in the snow, this could potentially have a tendency to want to oversteer more than a non-welded diff, so that is something else to take into account. So if your car is your daily, you might not want to do this. If you're worried about tire wear or something, you might not want to do it. With this being just a drift car and a track car, I'm not worried about any of that. But depending on how you use your car, you might want to do something different. As far as dependability, my Fox body diff was welded, and I drove that thing to Myrtle Beach and back and actually dailied that car for a little while with a welded diff, and it was fine. I did eventually fry a pinion bearing that might have been from some extra metal in the diff, I'm not sure. I still haven't opened that diff up to even look. I have a whole nother rear that's going in that car eventually. I also welded my Skyline diff, and that's been welded for a couple months now. It's been a one drift event, and it held up that entire event for Amanda, and we also drove it to Jersey and back, and there was no issues. It's a little noisy, but I think that's just bad bearings, not caused from the welding, but we'll do that at some other point too. We could have just rebuilt the clutch packs. You can buy the clutch packs pretty cheap. It's a little more time consuming, but like I said, I want this to be as consistent as possible. And with welding, it's a bit cheaper. There's no break-in time. We can take this thing to the track tomorrow if we wanted to, and it should be fine. So let's get started. I'm going to show you how to do this, give you some tips. Pretty much the only things you're going to need is some hand tools and a welder, and yeah. Now that there's nothing suspension wise that's holding the axle up too high, we're going to go ahead and throw a pan under, which we already have, and we got a jack underneath of the axle housing just to give it a little bit more support. We don't want to put the full weight on the control arms. The axle assembly is pretty heavy. I can't remember the exact weight, but it's over 100 pounds. I've had to bench press one of these before, and it wasn't that fun. You really don't want to put too much suspension strain on that upper control arm and the lowers, and also the drive shaft. So that's why we got that jack under there, just to take a little bit of the pressure off. So my diff cover is a B&M piece. It's a really nice cover. It's got some bearing supports on it that it's more for drag racing, I guess, but it puts a little bit of load on the bearing caps and gets a little bit more support. I got it just because it's a stronger option. I've had this thing on the car for a little while and it's been pretty nice. It's almost too pretty to have on here though, because it just gets hidden. It's one of those details that nobody really sees. And the rest of my axle housing is just crappy and rusty and gummed up. But anyway, what you want to do is take your drain plug out of your cover. If you got a stock cover, I think a 3/8 extension fits in it, and that's fine. The B&M cover, all the bolts are going to be 1/4 inch Allen. This is going to be for the drain plug and all the caps holding the cover on. We're going to take the cover off. I think on the stock one, the cover bolts are like 7/16 or something. Can't remember. It's been a while since I took the stock cover off. On the stock cover, those bolts just seem to want to snap off. On my Fox body, I think I snapped 3 of them or something crazy. And then you got to drill them out with an easy out, and it sucks. That's another good benefit to the B&M cover. All the hardware is a lot stronger than the stock stuff, and it's not going to snap. If you haven't messed with diff fluid before, diff fluid is really smelly stuff, so you might want to wear gloves for this, and maybe a shirt that you really don't care about. We're going to go ahead and just pull the drain plug, let everything drain out, give it some time, maybe go grab a beer, and then we're going to pull the cover off, and then we're going to clean it, let it sit for a little bit, and then weld this up. We got the car up pretty high. It's not enough that we can sit up straight underneath it here or anything, but it's a lot better than having to pull the whole axle housing out. At this point, if you did want to take the whole axle assembly out, you would just have to take the lower control arms off, your brake lines, any kind of speed sensors that you have for ABS, your e-brake cable, which I don't have an e-brake on this anymore, and then your upper control arm bolt, and also the flange bolts on the drive shaft. So really, as it sits now, it's not that far from being completely out, but it does save a lot of time to just do it this way. So that's how we're gonna do it, because we got stuff to do. I can't remember if the drain plug on the factory cover is magnetic or not, but this one is. You can see that there's a bit of material on here. This is probably material from the clutches just slipping. This rear's been slipping quite a bit the last couple events we went to. You can see that that's all just really fine metal. If you're doing a lot of burnouts or drifting or something, this is pretty much what's gonna happen. We changed the fluid when we did the dual caliper brackets, so this fluid's probably a year old, maybe 2. I can't remember when we did the dual caliper brackets. So this is pretty much all just from doing burnouts and stuff, and the clutch is slipping. You want to make sure that you clean your housing out as much as possible when you do this. So this is also going to make the bearings live longer if you change your fluids regularly, if you're drifting and stuff. I mean, this is pretty chunky actually, but we're going to clean it thoroughly once we get a little bit more fluid out. It's hard to see on camera, but the actual fluid is pretty clean. You can still see through it, which means that it's not completely black or anything. I really feel like a lot of the stuff's just going to be settled to the bottom. If you could smell this through your screen, you would understand how bad diff fluid smells. But if you're working on a car, you probably know that already, and you feel my pain. We got most of the fluid drained out. So now we're gonna go ahead and loosen up all the bolts and only take the bottom ones out and then crack open the cover while the top bolts, well, like 1 or 2 of the top bolts are still in. That's gonna allow the cover to kind of flap out, get the rest of the fluids out, keep your garage a little less stinky. Because if you take them all out at the same time and then try to break the sealant, this is all sealed on with RTV. I think even from the factory it's sealed on with RTV now. But anyway, if you do it all at once, the cover's gonna pop off, hit you in the face, and put fluid all over the place. So keep a couple on the top and you should be fine. Now to break this loose, you're not really supposed to use screwdrivers as pry bars or anything, but that's what we're gonna do. Or you'd use a flat bar or like a really thin chisel or something, I guess. I don't know what you're really supposed to use. I guess if you give it a couple taps on the side, it'll break the RTV loose. You can see there's not much fluid left in it. So we're gonna go ahead and take it off all the way. So now we can see inside our diff. So we haven't been in here for a while. We were in here when we did the dual caliper brackets. And that's when we broke this bolt here, which basically holds the center pin in and then keep these little S-clips from coming out and your gear set from falling apart. So once you're in here, you want to spin this to where you can actually see your spider gears and everything. So hopefully I left the car in neutral, because you need to be in neutral to spin the axle. You just grab one of the outer wheels and rotate the center section around just a little bit. I'm gonna have to put a tire on to give you a little more leverage to actually spin this around, because I can't do it by the studs. So this is going to be your carrier. With your carrier, you have spider gears And there's clutch packs in here behind these spider gears. They basically lock up under load and it makes both wheels spin. What we're gonna do is clean this up and we're gonna weld the spider gears to the carrier. And we're gonna try to keep all this clear. Some people will actually put a plate in here. That might be a good idea for a car that's making almost 600 to the wheels, but we're not gonna do that right now. We're just gonna weld the spiders to the carrier and see how that holds up. Hopefully it doesn't break, but if it does, then we'll actually go ahead and plate it. Also, if you plate both sides, you wind up not being able to take your axles out ever again. So if you do bend an axle or snap an axle, you can't take this all apart to take your C-clips out. And the C-clips is what let the axle pop out. So that's another reason we're not going to plate both sides. Like I said, we might wind up plating just one side at some point, but I think we're just going to weld the spider gears to the carrier. It seemed like a lot of people have good luck with that. What we're going to use to clean this is one of the most important steps of this entire process, and you should really pay attention. If you're on your phone or something right now, please get off your phone. This is important. I really don't want anybody to get hurt, and this is a real big safety concern. When you go to clean your diff, you're going to want to use non-chlorinated brake cleaner. Emphasis on the non-chlorinated. I'm not sure what the difference is on these. I think I bought these different times. I thought that I needed more, and you're only going to need 1 can maximum. You really don't need like 2 cans or anything. But anyway, emphasis on this non-chlorinated, because if you have the chlorinated regular brake clean and you take a welder to that, you're going to have some brake cleaner left in there somewhere, and you're going to ignite that chlorinated formula, and you're basically going to create chlorine gas, which is very toxic. It killed a lot of people in World War I and World War II. Chlorinated gas is really bad stuff, and it's not even like it'll poison you a little bit. You'll just die, apparently. So don't die. You really don't want to die, because you probably got people to care about you and stuff. So another really important safety thing is to disconnect your battery. We did that already earlier because we were opening doors and stuff, and I didn't want the battery to die. But disconnect your battery, because if your battery's hooked up when you hook a welder to this, you're going to be throwing your welding voltage and amperage through the chassis of the car, and that's going to make problems happen and burn your computer, and you don't want that to happen. So yeah, don't do that. No chlorine gas, and no batteries. You might even want to put a little bit of cardboard down, because you're going to make a big mess when you do this. If it's dark under your car, make sure you're not pointing a nozzle at your face, because it'll burn. Also use this in a well-ventilated area. It smells strong, dude. Let that sit for a little bit. As for welders, we're going to be using the Harbor Freight MiG 170. This is the titanium MiG 170. This is kind of like their intermediate welder. It seems to work really nice. I've had it for about a year. You don't have to get something this fancy. I think this thing was like 400 bucks. I can't even remember what I paid. It wasn't like stupid expensive, but it was expensive enough that I really needed to justify buying it. The main thing with welders is that you really don't want to use flux cord stuff. I know a lot of people weld diffs with flux core. We got some flux core wire, but I really don't mess with flux core. When you have flux core, it winds up making a lot of splatter. When you have a lot of splatter, it winds up getting all over the diff, and then you got metal all over the place, and it's going to fry out your bearings and stuff. I guess they make some like anti-slag stuff that makes it easier to clean up, but I'd rather just buy a bottle. The bottles, you can get them from any like oxygen supply place. This is going to be a 75% argon, 25% carbon dioxide mix. You can get these, I can't remember what I paid. I think it was like 100 bucks for everything. As far as the tank, you basically just get the tank, and when you need more gas, you just exchange it, kind of like propane tanks and stuff. If you have a bottle set up and just non-flux cord wire, just a solid core wire, it's going to make a much cleaner weld. No slag, nothing you got to clean up later. We've also TIG welded diffs before. TIG is actually a pretty good option to weld a diff. It's a little overkill, to be honest. You can kind of get a little more in the corners and use some filler rod and kind of like beef it up a lot more. But a MIG like this is going to be quick and easy, so we're going to use this. And for amp and speed settings, we basically want to put this as high as we can go with this particular wire. We want to make sure that it's nice and hot. Really, it's better to use some 035 wire, but all we have is 030 right now, and we're only on 120 volts. So we're going to go for the 1/8 inch steel setting, which is going to be 260, 18.5, and 5 to 10 on the inductance. So we got 260. Put this up just a little bit more. And this, we're going to put kind of halfway. Make sure we got a lot of wire left. The other thing I recommend is having a propane torch handy. Basically heat up the spider gears, get them nice and hot before you start welding. It'll kind of eliminate any cracking. It'll also let it burn off any kind of oil that's there. Make sure you have a fire extinguisher handy, and then just put your shield on and start welding the spider gears to the carrier. So for welding shields, I have this Vulcan from Harbor Freight. This Vulcan's actually really nice and comfortable. I've had this thing for about a year or two. My previous welding shield really sucked, and I borrowed a really nice one from my old roommate, and that one sucked. I think that one was by Miller, and it seemed to not want to actually work as far as auto darkening, but this thing works really quick and easy. I should probably take better care of it since it's getting dusty and getting some scratches on it. But it's fully adjustable. It's got a grinding setting, which we've actually used recently for cutting bolts and stuff on the Mustang when that panhard bar got stuck. But there's a lot of adjustments. So you're gonna have it on welding mode and just kind of a normal setup. When you hit the test button, and make sure that you have everything set how you want it and you don't blind yourself when you start welding, because that's what happened when I borrowed that Miller. The headband on this is pretty comfortable. I like it. I got a big ass head and it seems to fit me pretty nice. So yeah, this is gonna be what we're gonna use for that. As for gloves, we're gonna be using Harbor Freight Vulcan Defender Series TIG gloves. These are pretty easy to move around in, so that's why I went with these. And they seem to be pretty heat resistant. I've touched some hot stuff with these before and it's fine. Alright, don't judge my welds, damn it, this isn't a SEMA build, you're not going to see it. But you can see that the spider gears are now welded to the case, and we also threw a little bit of material in the corners from spider gear to spider gear, and that should give us a pretty good locker. The main thing with doing this is making sure that you got penetration and making sure that everything melts through from metal to metal, and then you're throwing a little bit of filler in there. If you don't have penetration, this is just going to break. You're going to get chunks of weld in your diff. We're going to throw a little bit more in the corners like we did up top, and we should be good to go. Got some welds going from gear to case and gear to gear. So we're going to go ahead and do the back side now. Clean this up a little bit more. Hopefully it's not hot enough that this ignites. Your welds don't have to be for aesthetics when you're doing this. As long as you have some metal fingers grabbing all the spider gears to the carrier and the spider gears to the other spider gears, you should be safe. That means the spider gears aren't going to spin, which means both wheels are going to spin the same direction at the same time, and you don't have to worry about your diff locking up anymore. So we're going to wait for this to cool off, then we're going to clean it up. If there's any kind of metal in there, you want to be able to just clean it out of the bottom. If you had any wire that just broke off or something, make sure you clean it out of the housing. And then we're going to clean the surfaces, put some RTV sealant on it, and bolt this back up, and then we can test it. So before you put any kind of diff fluid in, you're supposed to wait 24 hours. But in the meantime, because we want to get this thing done, we got a little customer project coming in tomorrow. We're going to put everything back together and then fill it with fluids tomorrow morning before the customer car comes in. To fill the diff, you can either use the plug that's in your cover. I think that factory cover might have one, I can't remember. Or you can use the vent that's on the axle housing. You can unscrew this and just fill it through that hole. That's probably actually what we're gonna do. It's a little bit easier to access that when everything's together. So let's put it all back together best we can and put our new RTR panhard bar in, and we can go home and sleep and relax until we can fill this tomorrow. And then we'll go for a test drive too. Putting everything back together is just gonna be opposite of what you did before. We're gonna start with putting the springs back in. We took the springs out to get a little bit easier access to a couple things. And we got new hardware for the panhard bar and a couple bolts for the sway bar end links. Yesterday I cut my finger open pretty bad and that sucked, but I got this side of the panhard bar in. That took way too long. Because the previous panhard bar was locked and seized, when I unscrewed it and was beating on it, this bracket that was attached to the housing wound up getting a little distorted and warped and stuff. It was sticking out too far and the hole was too low. I had to hammer on it, pry on it, but whatever. Reaching behind there is when I cut myself, trying to feel the hole that's back there. If you're reaching back there, wear gloves and be careful. And also make sure that there's like no load. This side's probably the one to do first, honestly. We gave the RTV sealant 24 hours to seal and everything, so we can go ahead and add fluids finally too. So the rear is going to take 2.125 quarts. I'm not sure what that is in liters, but because our diff cover is a little bit bigger, we do about 2.5 in this rear. They recommend that you use 75/90 on a Ford Mustang rear, and this is the Valvoline synthetic. I got this because this is what Walmart had that was cheap and synthetic. I like that it's in a bag. You can bend this and like get it in there a little bit easier. It's actually a pretty good idea. Good job, Valvoline. Really, we could have just bought the cheapest Walmart brand stuff because we're probably going to change this fluid shortly after doing this. When you weld your diff, you're probably going to have some metal that sinks to the bottom, so you might want to do a fluid change shortly after doing this. But we spent the extra money because that's what was on the shelf. Don't cut the tip too much or else it's not going to fit in that hole. Ow! And you can just squeeze this in there like it's an IV bag or something. I don't know. I'm not a nurse. I don't know how IV bags work. As you're doing this, check for leaks from the diff cover. Make sure you sealed it up right. Ours looks dry, so we should be fine. Alright, let's do a second bag. Bag number 2. Should be a little more careful with this one. Oh, or not. And for doing a half a quart, we're actually going to use a old school regular quart. We had some spare royal purple laying around from the last time we did a diff change. And we're going to use that half quart that was in there. And I probably won't film that because my hands are now stinky. I don't want to get the camera stinky. So yeah, 2.125 quarts, which is like 2 1/8 or 2 1/2 if you get a big diff cover. Sounds disgusting. Oh yeah, when you're doing this, put a rag down. Forgot to mention that. So since you have your vent out, it's also a good idea to clean this. Just take some brake cleaner and spray it on there. Sometimes these will get clogged up and that can make seals leak and stuff. So just clean it up, that way it can move around and stuff and act as a vent for your rear axle. And then give this a second to dry and then you can put it back in. We can go ahead and put this side of the panhard bar in. Make sure this bolt for the panhard bar brace is loose because that's going to give you some more wiggle room for getting the panhard bar in, and then you should be good to go. Jacking it up will also move that over a little bit. And there we go. Hopefully if yours was seized up, you didn't break this nut, because apparently this is like 50 bucks and they would have to order it, and you can use a regular nut, but I thought it was good to mention that this thing was so expensive. We're just reusing the one that we had. It was only the bolt that was messed up on ours. Before we do the sway bar end links, we want to make sure we put the springs back in. We're currently running H&R Super Sports in the rear. We could have ran a little bit lower with the BCs. The H&R rears are a little bit of a softer spring rate than the BCs, which will give us a little more weight transfer. At least that's what I told myself. So that's why we put the H&R Super Sports in the rear. We had them laying around already. Don't forget your isolators. I've heard of people not running these, but I feel like it would make a bunch of noise if we didn't. Next, we're going to go ahead and put our sway bar end links back in position. When you're jacking the rear up, make sure these are already facing the way that they got to go in that pocket. You got to make sure that they're both in the same position, because if one's facing down, you're not going to be able to swing it back up. You're just going to hit the bracket when you go to swing it up. Just take your foot and kick this thing up a little. And you can jack it up. This is also going to be the time where you're going to want to guide the springs a little bit. Just take your hand and as you're jacking it up, make sure that it seats in the pocket. It should seat on its own, but just make sure it's not to the side or anything, because then you'll have a bad time. Now that it's jacked up a bit, we can go ahead and put the end links in. So you don't want to jack it up all the way, just jack it up enough to where these end links can reach the pocket. Just gonna have that finger tight for now and go do the other side in case we gotta drop it or something. Now just tighten these up. Before you do your sway bar end links, put your shocks on. So we did the shocks, sway bar end links, and everything is pretty tight. We double checked everything. We also double checked our spacers and our dual calipers. A lot of times brake calipers will get loose, and that's not a good thing when you're trying to drift. So we tighten those up, shocks are tight, and we're gonna put some wheels on the car, try to adjust the panhard bar. Get our panhard bar adjusted to where it's pretty much got to be. We're going to jack up the pumpkin until the weight starts getting taken off of the jack stands. Not so much that it's a foot up in the air above the jack stands or anything. Now that we're close to where our ride height's going to be, we can adjust this turnbuckle in or out. And then we can either eyeball it or take a 2-foot level on the side of the flares and then measure and make sure that the distance is the same from left to right. No, it actually doesn't look that bad. So once we're level, it's hard to do this with one hand. It's about 1/4 inch from the wheel to the flare. It's a little more distance on this, so we want to make it a little bit longer. Alright, we got this about even, so we're going to go ahead and lock this down. Going to need a pretty big adjustable wrench for this. I think those nuts to lock it down are like, I don't know, like 30-some millimeter. This barely fits. Now let's take it off the jack stands and take it for a test drive. So you don't run over any of your tools. Oh, it hasn't been this slow since air. I miss air suspension sometimes. Hook our battery back up. When you're doing this, make sure you don't hit any metal. Your battery will blow up and kill you. Except on the negative side. The negative side, you can hit all the metal you want, as long as it's not that positive side. So that's it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Like I said, don't use chlorinated brake cleaner, and have a fantastic day.